Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about Middle Eastern influences on Western costume and fashion. The thing is, this theme is very vast, and there are a lot of topics that can be discussed, but I don't have much time, so I'll try to be as brief as I can and kind of cover the main, the most important points. Okay, I'll start with 19th century, the beginning of 19th century, as with Napoleon, and as it gives a really good example of the point I want to make. So Napoleon was a very interesting person, and he won over 60 battles during his lifetime, and he was feared all over the world, in Europe in particular. Um, but one battle he lost, and that battle was her, Joséphine Beauharnais. He fell in love with her, and he was crazy about her. He was sending this incredible love letters after the first day they met, and he was saying all these wonderful things to her. But she wasn't convinced that much. But she had a husband before. He was executed during the revolution. So she was 6 years older than him. But she was fascinated by his sort of desire for glory, because Napoleon wanted to achieve the glory of Alexander the Great, and that dream happened to few people in history. So what happened with after the revolution was that Napoleon decided to he became an emperor, and he wanted to restore the monarchy, the Ancien Régime, as it was during the Bourbon time. So it was a tradition of some sort for the queen, which Josephine became, to dictate the fashion. She and this dress was very popular during the time. Sort of, it started from around the end of 18th century and the beginning of 19th century, and lasted for about 20 years. The Empire line dress, also called directoire. Some people find differences in it, but it's not very important for us today. What I want to talk about is the shape of this dress. Basically, it was underwear. Women never were so naked in history of France or Europe. Even a decent Roman woman wouldn't be able to imagine herself wearing that outside. So because of the simplicity of the dress and sort of unchanging silhouette for a while, the only way to kind of make it interesting or decorate it was to add some sort of decoration on the hemline, or wear a shawl, add some sort of borders. And that's where our story really begins, because at the end of 18th century, Napoleon decided to conquer Egypt and Syria. He failed, but it was a very patriotic idea to kind of, the Egypt became popular. It was the first Egyptomania in Europe. And we'll see later, I'll just, yeah. It didn't really, this Egyptomania didn't really affect the shape of the dress that much, but what it did, it added some sort of pattern and decoration, and that would become a very important part of the Orientalism in Europe. It was all about embroidery and decoration. It would change shapes as well, but we'll talk about it later. So here you see, this is actually a dress worn by a Russian woman, and that's dated around 1810, because in Russia, obviously, fashion was much slower than in France. The fashion for the Egyptian decoration only lasted for 3 years. It was mostly, Egyptomania mostly affected the interiors, the furniture design. I'm sure you all know this famous portrait of Madame Rocamier lounging on this sort of chair, which was called after her, which is now called after her, Rocamier. Then we have this, but we'll get back to this. So the most important thing to understand is that Egypt, it wasn't, at that time no one had any idea what Egypt was. When Napoleon told the Directoire government that he wanted to go to Egypt, they had no idea. They didn't know how to get there, what was happening. He might have as well said he wants to conquer Mars. It was as foreign of an idea. So when these decorations started to appear, it wasn't in fact Egyptian at all. They were mostly Persian influences, the palms, the exotic birds, and that sort of would dictate the development of Orientalism during the later decades, because Western Orientalism, it was never divided into a particular country. It was never influenced by one thing. It was everything. It was mixed of things from Morocco to Japan. But today I'll try to kind of dissect it into Middle Eastern influence and only talk about those influences from the Middle East. This portrait of Marie Antoinette, which I'm sure you all have seen before, the reason I want to talk to her, not only because she started, she basically gave birth to that Empire line dress, because that's your famous chemise à la reine. She decided to wear basically underwear outside. It was so shocking at the time. No one could possibly imagine that. But you see, the thing with Marie Antoinette is that she was one of the most hated French queens in history of France, and particularly before the Revolution. And that was for two reasons. First of all, when she arrived to Paris and to Versailles to meet her future husband, Louis XVI, she was only 14, so she was still a very young girl. But it was somewhat a tradition at the time for kings to have mistresses. It was the mistresses that would spend money. It was the mistresses' prerogative almost, because they were there to entertain the king. They had the right to do that. When the wife, her job was to save the money for the country. So here, and because their marriage wasn't consummated for many years, or 7 years, because Louis XVI had a bit of a problem, he did. I'm not going to get into details, but you know, then he had an operation and it worked. But what else? Yeah. So she hated this whole. They hated her because she was spending money. Maybe you've heard of Rose Bertin, who was her fashion designer. And Rose Bertin was a commoner. She would come to Versailles every day. They even called her a minister of fashion because she almost had an office there. She would come every day, bring the fabrics and textiles, and they would pick what things for the next outfit. But then, at the same time, there was a very strict etiquette. Life at Versailles was very public. It was very, everyone could be present during the time the king wakes up. There was all these rituals, who would hang him the shirt, who would hang him the dress, etc. And she really hated it. So she had this idea of creating her own world. And that's, it's not the first time in history, but it's a very good example of how fantasy in fashion is born, which would lead to this Middle Eastern fantasies later. She dreamed about this life without etiquette, life, a very sort of pastoral, idyllic living where she wearing simple clothes, surrounded, like a Disney princess. You think about Disney princesses, they're birds singing, they're, you know, maids in beautiful dresses, but very simple, like peasants, but fairy tale peasants. Next, like across the street, there were people dying of hunger before the revolution, but she created this, she spent a fortune on that sort of, to create that world. Louis XVI built for her a palace called Petit Trianon. So that's, but queens of France, they always lead the fashion. They were always the one who would dictate the fashion. And that would happen to Josephine. So once she started wearing those Empire line dresses with Egyptian embroidery to celebrate her husband, everyone started wearing it as well. But you see what I'm trying to say, the kind of the idea of creating a dress because you want to be somewhere else, to dream, and that's what she was doing. Of course, then they chopped her head, but that's a different story. And by the way, you know, when she was on the guillotine, they cut your head, and when the executioner Samson showed the head to everyone, she opened her eyes, some nerve clicked, and she opened her eyes and she saw, like everyone was silent because it was terrifying. And of course those people who executed her, then also executed by the same executioner, but that's revolution for you. Right, so I'm going to say talk very briefly about Louis XIV, who was, and the birth of Orientalism in Europe. The thing is, it's a very sort of gross generalization that I'm going to make now, but we can divide French Orientalism and British Orientalism as two different things, because in Britain it was always India orientated, and in France it was Middle Eastern influence. And the reason why, because in France, hold on, just give you exact date, in 1536, King of France, Francis I, signed agreement with Suleiman the Magnificent, and it was the first Franco-Ottoman alliance in history. It was first non-ideological, non-religious alliance, and that was a way for Eastern influence to come to France. And through this alliance, the whole Europe hated, particularly the Vatican, but it lasted until the Napoleon's invasion in Egypt. But what's interesting is this. No, sorry, not this, this. I'll give you exact date because, sorry, I don't remember dates very well. So in 1669, so it's by the end of 17th century, the Turkish ambassador, Ottoman ambassador, Suleiman Aga, brought coffee to Paris. But it wasn't coffee as we imagine it today. It was the whole experience. This is Madame de Pompadour, who was the mistress of Louis XV. And that's what café looked like. So it wasn't just a man bringing a coffee to a woman and that's it. It was the whole experience, the interiors, the coffee was served in a certain mug on this beautiful, made in porcelain with this napkin with golden fringe, and the people would speak to the Suleiman Aga through the interpreter, and it had all this incense. So it created this another fantasy. And that time, people started wearing turbans and incorporating the Turkish traditional dress into their wardrobe. And that's actually how the first cafe in Paris started, because of that. And so today we think, imagine a scene. Two people sitting in a cafe, one is wearing a suit, a man, a woman wearing trousers and a blouse. And all of what I just described is come from Middle East. It's coffee, three-piece suit, trousers for women, but I'll tell you in a second. So, the West. During the reign of Louis XIV, his cousin, Charles II of England, was exiled for a long time because, yeah, for whatever reason. And then well, because Cromwell was there and he was still alive, and it was all, I'm not going to get into details because I don't have much time, but he was exiled, and when he returned to England, he lived in, not in poverty, but in his mind it was poverty and misery. So when he came to England to restore the monarchy, he wanted to copy his cousin Louis XIV. And Louis XIV, he introduced all these ribbons and diamonds. He was covered in those wigs with diamonds and ribbons everywhere. It was all sort of very glamorous. But what happened was very interesting, because people in England, they never really understood that. They never really understood that fashion, and they couldn't relate to it. So what happened, there was a huge disaster, a plague happened. And then another plague in a few years. So the church brought this question to the king. It's like, well, this is all happening because of your lifestyle, because you're a sinner. You have to change things. You have to adjust to the reality of where we live today. So he consulted with his tailors, and they came up with an idea to introduce a Persian vest into the English wardrobe. You see? So that was the original vest. It was quite long. It was made of this silk velvets and embroidered and damasks. And actually, Charles II was the first one who wore it. And then over the time, it got shortened. And it turned into a waistcoat. And in fact, that was the time when three-piece suit was born, because people were in jacket, which also came from Persia, and vest and trousers. And then over the time, it shortened, it became a three-piece suit. That was the start of men's suit as we know it today, but also famous British tailoring. Right. What do you have? Oh, right. Banyan. No, I just get some water because. Right. In the end of 18th century, banyan was introduced. Banyan is sort of a bathrobe, T-shaped bathrobe, and this bathrobe was a very peculiar element in. It was incorporated in a very peculiar way because, as I said before, Orientalism, or like all the exotic influences, were mixed and matched. So they would take the shape of the banyan, make it in Chinese silk, and wear it, drink Turkish coffee with a fez hat or a Greek stocking hat. And Greece was a part of Ottoman Empire at the time as well. So it was very sort of confusing, but it was a dream, it was a utopia of a place that didn't exist. So it became sort of, it filled the gap of loungewear, because in Europe, they just didn't have, they had the dresses that they slept in, they had the dresses for formal occasions that they would go outside, and, but it was very similar to the ones they wore at home. But this one was a leisure robe for men. And that, this particular piece had a huge influence on fashion from that point on to today. Everyone from Armani to Chanel. Chanel introduced her pajamas and homeware in the 1920s. Armani kind of built his whole career on the sort of slouch style, but I'm going to move there because I have more pictures. At some point, men started wearing those exotic dresses outside. It didn't last for too long, but it sort of, it existed. But this is sort of more or less contemporary images of the slouch style. It was all taken from that idea of like the opposite of tailored, opposite of, you know, tailoring. It's pieces that cut in different shapes sewn together. That's kind of the idea of Western dress. The Eastern dress, it's more, there are less cutting, there are less pieces and less stitching. It's more sort of free and floating. So I'm just going to talk briefly about that picture. This is John Galliano's graduate collection from St. Martin's 1984. And he was inspired by, it was called Les Incroyables. Les Incroyables were a sort of group of people, like Précieuses before them, during the French Revolution, sort of Napoleon time, the way I start. And you see, he's wearing this robe, but he was inspired by Japanese designers, the Japanese avant-garde designers at the time. He mixed it with historic fashion, but this particular piece, he's basically wearing a bathrobe. That was very fashionable at the time. So it's very interesting how he manages to reference all this piece, but still make it look contemporary. And that's very important, because for designers to take influence in a different culture, it's a fantastic journey, but it has to be, it can't be costume, it needs to be, it needs to look contemporary, it needs to be reworked in the way that fashion works today, or at that time. Right, then we have, okay, this is the portrait of Lord Byron. I'm going to say just very briefly a few things about him. From about 1814, after Napoleon went to exile, etc., the Romantic movement started in France. And it was all about sentiments and feelings and dramatic landscapes and all this kind of emotions. And it wasn't about what's happening today. It's about mythological places or foreign places. So it was really influenced by Oriental cultures and Gothic past, or Gothic European past. But also what was happening at the time is the beginning of traveling, because that was the age of steam. So the first steam liner was invented, the first train started using steam, so people started to travel at the beginning of, after the first decade of 19th century. And Byron, for example, was one of them. He was doing this famous grand tour that sort of came from England. Aristocratic children at the time, they would go around Europe to find their roots, to see the Greek culture, to see the Roman culture, etc. And he fought at the War for Independence of Greece, and which cost him his life. But that was the time when Orientalism started appearing in paintings, and that was very interesting because most of those painters, they'd never been anywhere apart from Paris. They'd never seen it. It was their imagination, the way they imagined it from books, from maybe some illustrations. Some of them, of course, went, like Delacroix, etc., but not all of them. Now I'm going to talk about crinolines. You see, what happened in 1955 is the crinoline was introduced. And I chose this painting. It's James Tissot. He's fantastic for fashion history references, the best description of dresses, etc. But this painting really describes the idea of woman at that time. You see, for example, she's holding a child. The man is from a distance, he's not next to her, he's a little bit further. And that was the point of crinoline. It was, a woman was like an object, a motherly figure who was unapproachable. She was almost like a saint. Women became the center of art at the time. But it wasn't, there was nothing sensual about it. It was very motherly figure. And crinoline was a big part of that. The most famous crinolines, of course, by Charles Frederick Worth, who made it for Empress Eugenie, but he didn't invent them, they were before him. But because of that, it caused a reaction, this. People started dreaming about different culture, because the woman was so almost asexual. They started dreaming about this East that they've heard of, they've never seen. These harems of sultans that had a million of women in Ottoman Empire who wearing these floaty clothes, and you could see the flesh, and it was also erotic and sensual. So it started changing the idea of woman over the time, and then once we get by the end of 19th century, you will see it. And it became very popular for women, this is the Turkish corner, they called it. So people in their houses, they would build that. They would they would put curtains, put some carpets. Sometimes they would even put a veil so people, guests don't see it. And it was a relaxing corner where people would relax. Then this happened. It did for a short period of time. In 1851, Amelia Bloomer saw some socialite wearing Persian costume. It was a fancy dress party. And wearing harem pants. So Amelia Bloomer, who was a feminist, feminist, not in our sense of the word, but feminist as they were then, she introduced trousers for women. That was the silhouette. That was a sort of jacket, quite long, knee length, and trousers. It caused huge scandal. She came to London, and she started preaching about this new fashion for women. She tried to reform the dress, the crinolines, the stiff, the corsets, the crinolines, etc. She tried to liberate women. but men didn't take it lightly. They considered it as a sort of threat to their masculinity, that they thought it was their prerogative to wear trousers, and women couldn't do that because they're women. So this fashion disappeared very briefly. But then it came back at the end of the century in the shape of riding costume. When bicycles became popular, women started wearing that. And they were using it for bicycle ride, because obviously with the bustle at the time, which was a sort of reworked crinoline with the extension just at the back, they couldn't ride the bicycle. So this costume was created, which was obviously inspired by Persian trousers and Amalia Bloomer. Then, after in the 60s and 70s, a new movement in art started happening. The Pre-Raphaelites and symbolism and all this kind of magical imagining things, the mysteries, etc. So in England was invented an artistic dress. And that was a dress that didn't have a waist. So it wasn't directly taken from any particular country in the Middle East, but it was unconsciously inspired by banyans that I talked about. But in this picture, I chose this picture not because this is it looks like artistic dress, but it's not. It's actually, it's very interesting because this is a Chinese robe. I think it belonged to some Chinese emperor that was turned outside. So you see these bits, actually, on the other side there would be embroidery. But it was turned upside down. And then Erdem, Canadian-Turkish designer, he reinterpreted this dress. So you see, it's very interesting to see that it came originally, like the original shape would be oriental, then it would come up, but it's not a dress, it's sort of some abstract cloak or whatever it looks like, and then it was interpreted in a, very European dress with the butterflies or whatever that is, buchens. Anyway, next. Then, very important, I'm going to talk about very briefly about William Morris and Oscar Wilde, because when Oscar Wilde wrote Salome, Audrey Beardsley created these fantastic illustrations, and Salome became the symbol of aesthetic movement of the end of the 19th century. It was the last romantics of the 19th century. That Salome became, she symbolized the new woman, the woman without crinoline, but not European woman. It was a fantastical woman, it was a mysterious woman. She would have exotic animals, she would have all kinds of exotic things surrounding her, the mystery, the almost to the point of supernatural. And that was the appearance of first femme fatale that would then influence the rest of the century and the beginning of 20th century. And William Morris, very interesting, because originally he wanted to, and so was Liberties, etc. in London, they never intended to import Turkish or Persian textiles. They wanted, in fact, they considered it as a new market for themselves to produce British fabric and sell it in the Ottoman Empire. But when they came there to learn about the business, etc., they started the import. So that's how the textiles started, Eastern textiles started appearing in the West. But William Morris in particular, he was obsessed with carpets, and he took so much from Persian carpets. If you think about the exotic birds and peacocks, like you can see here, and actually the way the pattern is built, it's you can see so many references. And actually at the V&A there is a carpet that he was particularly inspired. And so if you ever get a chance to come to London, you can go and have a look. Right, let me just see if I missed anything. No. Right, and that was Salome film interpretation of the Salome. The costumes were designed by Natasha Rambova, who was wife of Rodolfo Valentino. And she, it's very interesting because that was the time when Hollywood became important. And she was very much influenced by Russian ballet, but I will tell you about this in a second. Right. Oh, yeah. Okay. The new woman. So if in Middle Ages, and that lasted forever in Europe for a really long time, the idea of woman was, there's this famous Gobelin woman and a unicorn, and that was the idea of that woman. A woman with a sort of a virgin, with full of virtue, a mother, or pure. And by the end, with the help of people like Oscar Wilde and his friends, it was a new woman and a panther. And this woman and the panther motive became extremely popular in 1910, 1920s, and it lasted until today. It lasts until today, in fact. And I'm just going to talk briefly about this because you see, for example, that Cartier watch here. This was the first time Cartier introduced leopard pattern into their designs. It was made of black onyxes and diamonds set in white gold, because at that time everything was set in white gold. The fashion for yellow gold was started in the 30s. And that was, in fact, the whole idea of a panther for Cartier started with this image. It was Georges Barbier, who was commissioned to do an advertising for Cartier, and he created this woman with the panther. But you see, they didn't ask him for panther, but it was there. It was, people kept panthers as pets. They irritated the drawing alphabet. He used L as a panther. Josephine Baker had a pet panther. Louisa Casati had cheetahs, etc. So that was the new woman. It was liberate an exotic woman. It wasn't. It was mythological woman. Right, and then there was a time that now we call La Belle Époque. In England, it was called Edwardian time, but in France, they call it La Belle Époque. They started calling it after, not that long ago, because after all these wars and First World War, Second World War, all these crises, that was the time of excess and luxury that everyone remembered as La Belle Époque. It was the time when people traveled on Orient Express from Vienna to Paris, and you could meet there anyone from some Turkish Pasha, Russian Grand Duchess, etc. It was a mix of people, everyone was sort of there. And there were two centers of La Belle Époque. It was Vienna and Paris. If in Vienna, La Belle Époque was more sort of aristocratic, in Paris it became very artistic. It was very much, people started spending money on art. And not just buying art, but sponsoring artists. And then these three women of La Belle Époque, who were very influential, very important for our story, Missy Essert, Louisa Casati, and Jean Toussaint. So the reason why Missy Essert, she was a musician, she married the founder of Le Revue Blanche, and she spent her millions on helping Sergei Diaghilev and Russian ballet to do their Russian season in Paris. Marquise de Casati, of course, was the epitome of femme fatale, and Jean Toussaint would become later the creative director of Cartier, and she, I can't remember who called to this. I think it was Elsie de Wolf, who said that she could dress in Indian dress better than anyone else, and it was she who would popularize yellow gold later. So Sergei Diaghilev, this is the time when beginning of 20th century, when Orientalism in dress, in costume, would hit its climax, where all those previous influences that we saw in the paintings, in occasional elements of vests, etc., this would come all together and everyone would be obsessed with this. That's he brought Russian culture, but not only Russian culture. He brought something extraordinary to Paris. The colors that, as Dana Vreeland would say later, changed the century. He had a gift for seeing talent in people, and he was very good at seeing the talent and helping to realize it. His this talent helped him to create those extraordinary ballets. And today I'm going to talk about Scheherazade, which changed everything. So, if you think about ballet in Europe, in 19th century, it was tutus, it was some sort of drawing of a fountain at the back, and that was it really. Tights, tutus, nothing exciting. So he brought those colors that Leon Bax designed for him, the costumes, the exotism of the East, the fantasy of the East that were sort of gathered through the 19th century. And the costumes were fantastic, but or lack of those actually, because when you see the costume, it's very like they were heavily decorated with jewelry, etc. But when the dancers would move, it would give an impression of complete nudity, and that. Remember, this beginning of 20th century, no one's seen it before. No one's seen naked people on stage. It was completely unthinkable. And Ida Rubinstein, who was Russian, come from a very aristocratic Jewish family in Russia, she wanted to become an actress, and it was incredible because at that time actress was equal to a prostitute. It was unthinkable to think about it, but she had a fabulous fortune and she was ready to spend it on realizing her dreams. So that's how she met Bakst and Folkin, who taught her how to dance. And she had the gift of mime, and she basically mimed the whole Scheherazade. But she was starring in Scheherazade, and she outshone Pavlova and all the other dancers. The costumes. You see, this is something that was never seen before. Those colors, the people just were shocked. It's hard for us to imagine today, but at that time there was, it's nothing like they ever seen before. It was show business. Before there was none. Poiret, very quickly. Poiret started at the same time as Ballet Russe. He started a little bit early, but he started doing Oriental design at that time. And his favorite, he revived the Empire line of beginning of 19th century, and he created this cocoon shape, which came from Middle East, and later he. Because originally his designs were very sort of heavy with embroidery and patterns and etc. But later he started doing things like this, which are very, very modern. And he hated modernity and avant-garde artists that happened in the late 10. But it was funny because he was the one who kind of introduced it as well. And there was always sort of, in fashion history, people always talk who was the first Poiret or Bakst or Ballet Russe, but it's in that time when people, it's in the air. You know how today fashion forms. Sometimes same designers doing exactly the same thing because they just sense it. They sense that something is coming, and exotism was that. It was in the air. This is 1998 couture collection by Joe Galliano, and it's very interesting because if you look at the dress, the Bugs drawing, it was clearly inspired by that particular costume, but he took the cocoon shape of Poiret. So it's in a way it shows you how designer can interpret things without being too literal. It doesn't have to be exactly the same thing, but the way it sort of combined, because Poiret was living at the same time as Ballet Russe, it was all kind of mixed together. So this is interesting to See, then I'm going to talk about Fortuny very briefly. Fortuny, who's famous for Delphus dress, which was inspired by this Greek sculpture of Delphus chariot, and but his father was collecting North African textiles, and in fact, Fortuny, he created this ultimate fantasy, ultimate Oriental fantasy, where he would take Chinese robe and make it with some traditional Moroccan textiles, or vice versa. He would introduce pagoda sleeves on banyan, or etc., etc. So it's that is how Orientalism and was working in Europe. But this is Jean-Paul Gaultier, and we see exactly the same thing today. Harem pants, some Mexican influences, tribal jewelry. It's all sort of, it continues the tradition of that. Then, briefly, Hollywood. This is Tede Barro, who became one of the first Hollywood stars, and she introduced, it's interesting how she was marketed to the public. She was marketed, she was born in Egypt, she was daughter of Pharaoh, and she spent her childhood under the shadow of the Sphinx, etc. She never been to Egypt in her life. But that sort of, it was the beginning of the second wave of Egyptomania. And in 1922, the tomb of Tutankhamun was found, and Tutankhamun became the first global celebrity, because everyone was talking about it. In London, they even wanted to call Northern Line, the line that's called Northern Line today, Tutankhamden Line, because it was running from Tooting to Camden, but they didn't do it. So we see the Egyptian influence everywhere. Cartier did the whole series of Egypt. Van Cleef did it as well. These are all pictures of dresses by Lam Vang that she ran this sort of Egyptian line for a long time. And this evening sort of pajama gown. She did, I don't know why you can't see it, but this was like a pharaoh embroidery on a dress. She used it as a styling element. That is like from 1936. So that's, but it was everywhere. It was in furniture, and because it happened just before Art Deco became a trend, it influenced Art Deco as well. The colors, the gold and black, and these shapes, etc. Right, Schiaparelli, very briefly, her father was an Orientalist. He was the dean of Roman University, and by the end of her career, she spent a lot of time in Tunisia, and she used a lot of reference from Tunisia, and particularly the veils, as you can see here. What's interesting about veils is that today in Europe, veils were worn through the centuries and in different periods in Europe. It all came from Middle East, of course, but today only two occasions: wedding and funerals. That's the only time women wear veils today. And then this is the Schiaparelli current season, designed by the team of Schiaparelli, and you see they put little fez head to reference her Tunisian period in her career. Right, next. After the Second World War, things changed. Everything Oriental was out. Everything, shawls, the harem pants, it was out. It was the time of Balenciaga, Dior, who were creating this sort of very European, they used a lot of historic references. But in the 60s, at the second part of the 60s, there was a revival of 1930s. So everything to do with Egypt, the Biba happened, and of course, with all these golden Egyptian themes, turbans, and there were films like Cleopatra and Lawrence of Arabia that influenced a lot the current fashion. And kaftan. Kaftan it's very interesting because it was Dani Brilliant who popularized the kaftan through her editorials. She used a lot of sort of Middle Eastern themes in her work. But this is a garment from Christian Dior, inspired by the kaftan, but modernized into European way. Okay, I think I'm running out of time, but I'll quickly. Originally, kaftan was introduced during the Byzantium time, because when Roman Empire was divided into two, and the second center of the Byzantium became Constantinople, it's straight away it had a lot of Turkish influences, and have embroidered those long coats, etc., etc. And after the end of Byzantium, it was Moscow who adopted, like Russia who adopted the Byzantium culture. So today, Russian priests wear exactly the same clothes. So if you think about it, it means that Russian priests wear traditional Muslim clothes, basically, today, which is very interesting to think about, covered in gold, etc. And this, I just put a reference of Dolce & Gabbana did the Byzantium collection, but obviously interpreted in a very obvious way. Well, yeah. Saint Laurent. Saint Laurent, I'm going very briefly about Saint Laurent. He did a lot of exotic collection based on exotics, particularly Middle Eastern influences. But this was the first fashion show as we know it today, the Opera and Russian Ballet collection. It started with the girl with the pearl earring painting, and then he developed into collection inspired by Le Ballet Russe. What's interesting about Saint Laurent, that he, like everyone before him, traveled only mentally. He didn't, he hated traveling because he was a very introverted person, very complex, but he didn't like to leave the house. Even when he would observe street fashion, he would do it from his car. Same was with his exotic reference. He would look at the books and come up with a beautiful idea. So we can say that he continues the tradition of Fortuny and all the others before him. Right, this is another collection, but everyone knows this with these fabulous sculptures. And then, very quickly, about what happened next. In the 70s, hippie happened, and everything, again, the kaftans, the Afghan coats became very fashionable. Fashion didn't have a direction anymore. After the 60s, fashion lost direction. It was era of individuality. Everyone was trying to express themselves. So there are a lot of mixed references, but people became very much, cities like London, New York, Paris became multicultural. So there were a lot of street style influences in fashion that started in the 70s that would we see even today. And then after that point on, fashion became very much like there were trends, etc. But Middle East, like Orientalism, as I generalized it, but it never really became a trend per se or influenced particular garment. It was themes for collections, but like a lot of, like Rifat Ozbek, famous Turkish designer who started Marlis McQueen, who used actually this thing twice, but that was always theme-based. Okay. And fashion for beards and tan also came from Middle East. Thank you. Do I have time?
I'm afraid we have time for 2 questions only.
Okay. Yeah, but I'm talking about Western fashion, in Western world. Yeah. I mean, some people, but like today, it's only for occasion, because we don't really have more occasional clothes for occasions. It's gone. Morning coats, etc. It's all gone. So it's only dresses, really. But which is a shame. But that's how it is. It's okay not to have it, but people like to have it because it gives the sort of. It's almost like it's a tradition. So people like to, and because we don't have dresses that we don't dress for occasions anymore. So it's nice to kind of adopt something very traditional in your look, So I think that's the reason. Yeah, thank you.